it's not going away. And unfortunately, I think what's happening is people think it's going away. You know, I spent some time thinking about this, wondering if this is something I should cover. I mean, I do politics from time to time. I haven't done a lot of that lately, other than putting content online for my classes because I teach political science. But I kind of thought this needed to actually have something going on, or something something I needed to cover because it's not going away. And unfortunately, I think what's happening is people think it's going away. So what I'm talking about is the everything that's happened after the George Floyd murder, and it's kind of really gotten seriously, I don't want to say out of control, because it almost seems like it's justified in getting as out of control as it actually is. But the problem is I suspect we're probably going to end up going back to the way things have always been, because when we looked at the Rodney King riots, I mean, I was working for a hotel at the time, and at the time I was stranded downtown in San Francisco, and getting home was basically a nightmare, and so I constantly look at that time, through my own eyes and my own perspective, and there were some really bad things happening during the riots themselves. But what kind of gets forgotten a lot of those times when we think about these things, we only think about the things that anecdotally affected us individually. I mean, the response was to something much bigger than the incidents that people complained about later on. And so that's kind of the situation we're in right now. I started following a lot of the protests, some that turned to riots, that turned back to protests again, some of the outrageous police responses to a lot of the stuff going on. And while there's a tendency for politicians to really try to make this a partisan issue, it should never have been in the first place. But for some reason, we're really good at doing that in this country. Because, I mean, in case you haven't really picked up on the way the United States works, or at least the society and the civilization underneath the United States, if you haven't figured this out by now, we live in very much a dichotomous situation or circumstance where we see everything as us versus them. And that's kind of what's actually happened. And so if you see rioting going on, if you see protesting going on, people are putting themselves or being forced into, this corner or this corner, and having to justify themselves based on these particular situations. And the problem I have with that is, I mean, in this, again, let me preface this with there are problems even with this approach to it. And the problem with it is people will react in a bad way to it, saying that looting's out of control, rioting's out of control, we need to get things back to normal, kind of a thing. But what we've kind of forgotten and we keep pushing away from is this lack of reality of what normal actually is. Because what's normal for me is a lot different than somebody who's living, in a poor neighborhood, who has police constantly in their neighborhood, coming down on them for all sorts of different reasons. And so it's easy to, be out in the suburbs somewhere and complain about the reaction and all that. Especially if you don't have any personal incentive to want to get things done because you were never affected in the first place. And whether or not you want to call that white privilege or whatever kinds of privileges there are, That is a big part of the problem, because I remember a lot of the protesting and everything that was happening around the Rodney King riots, and what ended up happening was people kind of, shuffled everything underneath the table and just kind of went, well, we need to clean up the problems after. And so, like, more police on the streets, crackdowns on this and that. And there was no attempt to actually deal with the, problems that got us to there in the first place. Problems that literally go back hundreds of years, and we haven't gotten anything better. I mean, we haven't done anything to make things better. And the reason I'm really focusing on this, and one second here. The reason I'm really focusing on this is I was actually reading an article in CNN today, which was basically talking about a NASCAR driver named Ray Cicerelli, I think is how you say his name. He's not like a, one of the big names of NASCAR driving, but kind of a junior level of the fast people. I don't really follow NASCAR all that much, so I just know that the name is strong enough to where people might recognize it. But again, I don't think he's really a household name. But basically, he got really upset and decided that he's no longer going to be part of NASCAR. And so after this season is over, he's pretty much done. And basically, he doesn't like the idea that they won't let him fly the Confederate flag, which has massive racist connections to it, the flag itself. I'm not saying he is, but what happens is people have literally put that in as, a racist symbol. As a matter of fact, if think of it this way, put this in perspective. You can fly the Confederate flag in Germany, and people do fly it in Germany, and people are going, well, it must be fine. And the reason they fly it in Germany is because they're not allowed to fly the Nazi flag. So what they do is they fly the Confederate flag as a kind of a go-to instead, because they're allowed to get away with that. And so therefore it represents, racism and, white superiority and all this other kind of stuff, which they can do that because there are these connections because of the South's connection to, slavery and all the things attached to that. And so there's a lot of racist kind of elements involved in the whole Confederate flag connections and all that. And so basically, the reason I started thinking this is probably something to talk about is because there's a lot of hypocrisy going on. And his statement that really got me was when he said that he can't stand the fact that they won't let him fly the Confederate flag, or worship the Confederate flag or whatever it is he wants to do with it. And he also doesn't like, football players or sports people who actually kneel during the anthem. And so his reason for not liking the actions on the Confederate flag is he said he doesn't support the Confederacy, but at the same time, he thinks of it as freedom, and so therefore they're taking away his freedom to, to fly whatever flag he wants. Yet he has a real problem with the fact that people kneeling are kind of representing, their personal feelings and their personal symbolism as to, how they feel about, racism. And the hypocrisy just really, really kind of bothered me on that. And so I thought I would just kind of talk about that. But the bigger problem, and this is why I'm actually talking about it, and probably not going to go anywhere with this anyway, but what I think the real problem is going to be is this is getting bigger and bigger, but it's hit a point where people don't know what to do. And so they're stuck in a situation where they want to do something. Government keeps, people in government keep, indicating, let's do something. And so far, the only thing I've actually seen them actually indicate they're willing to do is to like remove, either Confederate statues or to change the names of military posts that had Confederate generals as their names. And so very small, little tiny things, but nothing to really correct the problems, such as like police forces targeting African Americans, because they can. And that's been a huge problem. And if this doesn't get solved now, which is kind of the same thing, I made this argument back during Rodney King riots and the aftermath of them, and nobody did anything because nobody's listening to me anyway. but the thing is, we're going to do the same thing because politicians are going to do everything physically possible to kick the can down the road. And if they kick the can down the road, we're not going to deal with racism that exists right in our midst. And we're going to make it worse. We're going to make it so the next time something happens like this, and it will, I guarantee it will happen. I mean, there were atrocities taking place during the attempts to quell the riots, or even the protests. There were protests that weren't riots, that didn't become riots until the police reacted and made them riots. There were certain reports, like in Portland, of basically they were calling the police the rioters. So I mean, those are some pretty scary things to kind of think about. But the problem that I'm pointing out is we're going to hit a point where we need to do something, which is now. We're way past the era of needing to do something. I mean, slavery ended, what, 1865? Then we had in 1965 the civil rights movement, and we're still at the point where we're not doing anything. And so what's going to happen is we're going to basically kick this can down the road. Politicians are going to do nothing. They're going to do some little tiny, speck of something to say, look, we did something, we tried. Biden will probably end up becoming president, most likely, depending on whether or not, well, I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole different thing. But we'll end up in a situation where basically they're not going to do anything because it's easier not to do anything and to just kind of hope, well, people get better. And you'll start hearing this constant refrain of, well, it's 2024, so it's like, things are much better now, because it's 2024, as if by keep repeating the same date that you're in at that particular time somehow means you've gotten better than 1865, which is sad because we haven't. There's still a lot of the same things going on. The Klan is still operating out there, doing its thing. Used to be in the shadows. During this latest administration, seems a little more brazen and kind of proud of what they're actually doing. The whole NASCAR thing, just kind of showing you that people are still clinging on to those really, really bad ways. And hatred is a really, really easy thing for people to fall back on. And so my hope is we would move forward, but I don't think we're there yet. And the problem with that is I don't think we're trying to not be there yet, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna leave it at that. I just thought I would introduce that out there, and I figure for the the one person that might actually see this video, consider I'm that popular. But there we go. My thoughts on this. I'd love to hear your comments. If you've got comments on this, argue with me or agree with me or tell me ideas I haven't heard before, something that gets us all thinking, talking, that sort of thing. It would be great if politicians would really address this, I mean, seriously address it, I would like to see this in Congress. And I don't mean one side constantly fighting against the other and shaming, trying to shame the other. I'm talking about it and saying, how can we make things better? And literally just say, this is the way to make things better, and fight for making things better. Because it's over 200 years now, we haven't tried to make things better. We're just kind of hoping they just kind of eventually get better. Almost as if we're going to hit, this, Star Trek realization, we're going to be in the 23rd century and everything's great, but we've got to do something to get there. I'm not saying we're working towards Star Trek, but you get the idea. So, I mean, you're not going to have a better positive future unless people today are trying to make it a better possible future. And there are a lot of people, and that's where the problem is, that don't want things to get better. They want things to be the way that they were. And if that's the case, that's where we're going to end up. And we'll end up in much worse problems than we could possibly imagine. Because, well, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for listening.